Advisory Committee to order. We'll have Susan, our recording secretary, conduct the roll call.
Thank you. So as I call your name, just say here. Wendy Wolf,
Here.
Jeff Berg, Sandeep Berman, Mark DeLayden.
I'm over here, not there.
Okay, that's good. Jack Gleason,
Here.
Valerie Grover,
Here.
Annika Bankston, Mike Wang,
Here.
Phil Klein,
Here.
Brad Larson, Susan Morris,
Here.
Catherine Nuschler,
Here.
Mike Robinson, Patrick Shea, Jamie Sherman,
Here.
Lisa Valbrecht, Kevin Watson,
Here.
Tanya West Hafner. And I believe I just saw Jeff Berg join. Do you want to?
Jeff Berg is
say
here,
here?
yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Chair Wolf, I will watch for any other additions. We do have a quorum. And for those who have joined late, if I could make an announcement that because we are recording for the benefit of those who are joining by phone, we do withhold comments using the chat. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll call on you. If you're having audio difficulties, that's when you can use the chat to ask your question. So I'll be monitoring for hands being raised as well as questions specifically in the chat. So at this time, I will turn it back over to you, Chair.
Thank you. So next up is the reading of the executive order statement. Governor Walz has declared a peacetime emergency in response to COVID-19, and the Metropolitan Council Chair has determined it's not practical or prudent to conduct an in-person meeting for reasons stated in the governor's emergency executive order. Accordingly, committee members will participate in this meeting via telephone or other electronic means, and the meeting will be conducted under Minnesota statute section 13D.021 and today. We encourage you to monitor the meeting remotely. If you have comments, we encourage members of the public to email us at public.info@metc.state.mn.us, and we will respond to your comments in a timely manner. Next up is approval of the agenda, and we'll do that by consensus. So if anybody has concerns or wants to change the agenda, feel free to speak up now or raise your hand. And if nobody has any suggestions or concerns, then we'll consider the agenda approved. Thank you. Next up is
I do not see any hands.
Okay. Next is the review of the workshop summary. Are there any revisions or concerns from that information? If there are none, do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved. Phil Klein.
Thank you, Phil.
Second, Mike Wong.
Thank you. Susan, you can take the roll call.
Okay. Jeff Berg,
Aye.
Sandeep Berman, I don't believe has joined yet. Mark DeLayden,
Aye.
Jack Gleason,
Aye.
Valerie Grover.
Aye.
Do not see Annika Bankston. Mike Wang,
Aye.
Phil Klein.
Aye.
I do not see Brad Larson yet. Susan Morris,
Aye.
Catherine Nuschler.
Yes.
I do not see Mike Robinson or Patrick Shea. Jamie Sherman.
Yes.
I do not see Lisa Valbrecht. Kevin Watson.
Aye.
Thank you. And I do not see Tanya West Hafner, so those individuals are absent. Thank you very much.
And I'm I, you didn't call me.
Oh, Wendy Wolf.
Hi.
Thank
Okay,
you.
so on to our work. Our main purpose today is to exchange information and perspectives about the context and approaches to the challenge of water quality and emerging contamination in the Twin Cities metro area. This information will be reported to the Metropolitan Council and the Minnesota Legislature in 2022 to shape the development of recommendations and supporting information. Emily's going to present some background information, and then we'll have two of our committee members share their local perspectives, and then Lanya will lead the group exercise using the Mural online tool. So go ahead, Emily.
All right, thank you.
Greg, if you could bring up the first presentation, please. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Emily Steinweg, and I've been with the council for just over a year now. One of my bigger roles is leading the TAC committee, but I'm also here presenting today. So thank you again for taking time to attend our first MOSAC meeting for the 2021 to 2022 work plan on the topic of water quality and contamination. Next slide, please. So you may have seen this in the pre-meeting material, but I wanted to call your attention to it again. This slide shares additional information and resources that have recently been recommended for consideration by MOSAC and TAC members. So a few of these resources were shared at the March 23rd initial kickoff meeting, as well as shared by TAC members at the meeting last month. Next slide, please. So today you are being asked to share your recommendations as a committee around water quality and contamination, both current and emerging. Your perspectives will be used to draft content in the 2022 report to the Metropolitan Council and the Minnesota Legislature. They guide the council's water supply planning activities and will shape the preparation of the council's regional development framework. The information you are considering today includes input from the Water Supply Technical Advisory Committee, or the TAC, and reflecting the chair's intentions to approach the development of the MOSAC recommendations by working directly with local water supply stakeholders throughout the process to ensure their concerns are consistently understood and considered. This meeting is also a space to pool your collective expertise to address the region's increasingly complex water problems that require a collaborative approach to tackle. So today, we will introduce the draft of policy recommendations that describe the problem and challenge, a high-level goal, and actions to achieve that goal. This current draft is based on input from last month's TAC meeting, past committee and water supply stakeholder conversations, as well as individual interviews held with MOSAC and TAC members over the past year. Next, we will hear some regional and local information to help set some context on the issues our region is facing. Then we will have a group exercise to review and revise the draft problem statements and recommended actions, which will be led by Lanya. This exercise is a chance to share your thoughts and perspectives on recommended actions, as well as propose more actions. And then we'll wrap up with a review of the process used to draft the recommendations you are considering and the next steps. Next slide, please. Great. So I'll start with a quick sharing of the draft problem, the goal, and solutions proposed for the topics of water quality and contamination. This information is provided in more detail in the memo attached to the meeting agenda. So we've been talking and brainstorming over the past years, and we have heard now it's time to be more specific. It will be helpful for the council and water agencies to know more specifically what to be done and bring those big concepts into action. So looking back at these past committee and water stakeholder conversations, the interviews held with MOSAC and TAC members, and input from last month's TAC meeting, one question we heard when discussing water quality and contamination was, how can we as a region prepare better for the uncertainty of any new emerging contamination? So does this content provided in more detail in the memo attached to today's agenda that we will focus on today? Next slide. So as you think about the information and recommendations that MOSAC can share with the Metropolitan Council and the legislature, consider how the council and water agencies are best suited to help with the regional water supply challenges. The public water suppliers have responsibility throughout the entire process to get clean drinking water to customers. The communities generally focus on the treatment and distribution, and the source water appropriation and protection is managed by various agencies such as the DNR, Department of Health, Pollution Control Agency, and Department of Ag. So the Metropolitan Council, as the facilitator in the region, is here to connect those public water suppliers and agencies and works to improve those relationships to keep the system running. So today, please consider, where can we be impactful in this process? Next slide, please. So the information you share today, like I mentioned before, is informed by the Technical Advisory Committee. And then your guidance in turn will shape the thinking and the work at the Metropolitan Council, its various areas of impact, as well as decision makers like the legislature and other state agencies. Next slide, please. So as we share some regional and local background information, I want to highlight these points from the TAC meeting. These are their high-level considerations that we kind of discerned from the discussion, and they are incorporated into the memo with the meeting agenda today. So I'll give you a moment to read these considerations. Next slide, please. So as we head towards the discussion, I have a reminder of the water supply plan's definition of water supply sustainability. So this definition of what a sustainable water supply looks like for the Twin Cities region was created back in 2014 and 2015 by the group that was a precursor to TAC. So this definition came from those conversations with MOSAC, and through related public engagement. Next slide, please. One last consideration before local perspectives. The data shown here are from an MPCA tool called What's in My Neighborhood. So the gray and green dots on the map represent the thousands of records of potential contaminants and environmental permits across the region. So it's not a map of contamination, but just potential sources that we need to keep in mind and commit to managing. So as an example of the distribution of one of the categories in this database, the green highlighted dots are the solid waste records. So it just shows how it's spread all throughout the metro. Natural groundwater challenges and non-point source pollution issues are not shown in this tool, but we do acknowledge that they are something communities across the region do wrestle with. So the next big contaminant may be anywhere across the metro, and the question is, ready to deal with those emerging contaminants. Next slide, please. So with that background in mind, we'll move to a more local perspective. And Wendy, I will let you introduce our speakers today if that works for you.
Thank you. The MOSAC members who are speaking today are Brad Larson and Catherine Duschler. They've offered to informally share their perspectives about responding to contamination and changing regulations. They are not here to be subject matter experts with detailed information. Instead, they'll share their impressions and lessons learned as they worked on or watched the projects unfold. And there's a number of questions there that they're going to be speaking around that you can see on the screen. Welcome.
All right, I am going to jump in because it looks like Brad is not here. So I will, I'll just give a very high level description of what he is facing right now. So Savage, and I'm not eloquent at it, so please forgive me. So they've been doing water testing down in Burnsville Savage area, and there's multiple landfills that are near their source of drinking water. So they have detected some PFAS chemicals that at the last, so a month ago when Brad shared, they were not over the EPA health limit, but are measurable and they're there. So they're trying to deal with the public perception of the safety of the water. What do we do with these landfills? Because their water supply is the Kramer Quarry. So you may have seen that in the news recently. So they have 2 landfills. One is lined, one is unlined. And Brad spoke about this at the TAC meeting, and one of his points was, I mean, in all reality, the thing to do to protect the water would be to remove the landfills, either, remove the debris and line one of the landfills and put it back, or just remove it. And a big issue with that is funding. As you can imagine, that's probably a very expensive process. So yes, and we do have some more notes from Brad from his presentation at the TAC meeting in the TAC minutes, so we can send those out for reference. And he is open and willing to field any questions or discuss the issue with you. So overall, I guess in a nutshell, that is what is going on in Savage. And so then, Catherine, if you are ready, you can take the mic.
Okay, thanks, Emily. My discussion might be a little more sort of philosophical, kind of higher level. But Sophie Green, the MPCA's PFAS coordinator, and I were talking the other day, and we were just kind of talking about PFAS, and we were talking about kind of this conceptual idea that I have that sort of contaminants of emerging concern ought to go on kind of a bell curve, right? You have some pollutants you're just learning about and you're sort of wondering about, and then you have a whole bunch in the middle that you probably might cause some problems, but still detailed, and then a small number should really proceed out and be ones that we start to deal with, that we start to regulate. And I very much see PFAS as being on that end, out of emerging and into actual contaminants that we need to deal with in all our systems. And Sophie kind of said, well, she's like, that's never really happened before. In these kinds of strange and emerging contaminants, there aren't that many that have gone through that whole phase. And I think one of the things that I struggle with, and that I'm really interested with in us trying to do better at the PCA, is to have kind of a big picture, multi-step process to move in a really systematic way from that sort of, this is something of concern in the literature, or this is something that we pick up when we do our monitoring and we don't understand, to make good choices about, okay, then what do we need to do to understand this pollutant further, to do source investigation, to understand where it's coming from, and then to eventually, move us, if we need to that regulated place, and to really have good scientific backing for moving to each step. And I know this is something that I've talked about with my colleagues at MDH as well, and they've started to develop some contaminants of emerging concern kind of frameworks, and really see our role at the PCA as being kind of, at least at the starting point, to be kind of the surveillance monitoring people, doing the big picture, like what's out there in the environment and understanding what's there. And one of the things I think is really interesting is, how do we develop a consistent framework for starting to understand these contaminants of emerging concern so that we can adapt to what we're learning, but not be driven by sort of, concerns that may surface in the media or surface at the legislature that may not be things that we think are scientifically ready for that level of effort. So I really appreciate what I kind of saw in the slides about the ideas of funding, but funding that needs to be flexible. I think that's really important for us, as opposed to being, told that we need to look at something specific, right? There's so many emerging contaminants, and I'm just starting to learn about some new one called 6-PPD quinone, which is from tires, and I don't know much about it, but that's a new one that's starting to pop up. And how do we come up with frameworks so we can slot things sort of into the right place, and then also communicate about that, so that we can say, yes, if you're a citizen that's concerned about your source water and you're concerned about a specific pollutant, say, you know what, that is a pollutant of concern. Here's what we understand about it now. Here's why we think we need to learn more about it, or why we think we don't, and it's not a really big issue. And then at each step, as we sort of move from that, we're just beginning our understanding to we're investigating to we're maybe developing management and regulatory kind of frameworks to have very clear ways to make those decisions as things move forward, and to be able to communicate them, and to have a systematic and regular cycle for looking at those. And so that's really very much how I think about this contaminant of emerging concern issue. And then, of course, knowing it gets into all these things about how do you need to treat for it? How do you treat for it? All that stuff is complicated. But I think having foundational frameworks that help us understand, where are we with this pollutant? Is it something that we're just sort of thinking about and kind of in the back of our minds, or is it something that we've really clearly demonstrated needs to be managed and regulated? Will help then underpin all those sort of future decisions. So that's really all I had. That's just sort of a thing that's been going around my mind in a while for the last couple of years. How do we build that system? And are there ways we can build that system together? Are there things drinking water managers need from, say, the PCA, if we're monitoring source water or adding new standards that would impact your source water? What kind of things do you need to help communicate some of that moving forward? So that's what I had.
Thank you. We've got some extra time if anybody else wants to share their experiences. Feel free to speak up.
So if you have anything that you would like to share, feel free to raise your hand. I'll watch for those to come up. I see Phil waving.
Go ahead, Phil.
So go ahead,
There
Phil.
we go. Yeah, thanks. Actually, I just have some questions. I guess the biggest thing is on how do we determine what is a bad chemical? Why are when these chemicals are being used, are they tested intensively to determine whether or not they provide any type of health risk to the community before their use, or is it just companies just use them and then we're just left to deal with the aftermath? Can someone answer that?
I certainly don't have an answer, but pipe up anybody who does.
Right, there's so many things in our economy and in our environment that that's a little hard to answer. One of the things, right, we have this Toxic Substances Control Act, right, or TSCA, that is supposed to do initial risk review of new chemicals that are entering into commerce, and sometimes re-review chemicals that have been in place. It is a complicated law that I am just barely learning about, but that is kind of one of the places that's supposed to do that upfront work. But I think there's a lot of concerns about loopholes and exemptions for things that aren't in very large scale. So if you're talking about, chemicals that might be used that might come out of wastewater treatment plants and then eventually impact surface water, that is one thing that comes to my mind.
Okay, if I may, Chair. Also, I guess the question that I also had is how much is considered unsafe? I mean, is it a few drops? Is it a cup? Is it a glass? Or do you have to drink gallons or hundreds of gallons of the stuff in order to have any type of negative impact? I mean, how much is too much?
Right. And that's so site specific, chemical specific. I think those questions you're asking are all things that come to my mind when I think about how do we move from a chemical that people are interested in and maybe has some early indications that it's an issue, and move it through, do we need to learn more about it? Ask it. And that kind of question would be one of the things we'd ask in my mind.
And then the last question, Chair, if I may, please. The other thing is we have concerns with these types of chemicals that are entering our groundwater. What are other countries, like say, is Europe or like Australia, Japan, whatever, some of these industrialized countries, what are they doing to mitigate their infiltration of these chemicals?
You're muted, Catherine.
Yeah, I don't know that I can answer that one. I would say in general, my understanding is, Europe has different chemical safety laws than we do. And they move on more of a preventive what's the word, precautionary principle, in the you have to prove it's safe rather than you have to prove it's not safe. And so the framework of regulation is a little different. But in terms of actual, things on the ground for environmental, treatment, I don't know.
I guess, if I may, I guess one of the things that I'm questioning is if we can get this, like if Europe's doing that, if we can prevent this from entering the system in the first place, or at least mitigate it and stop it, that would help alleviate a lot of the issues that we'd be dealing with in the very get-go, as opposed to waiting till afterwards, and then now we're left with this bag of contaminants that we have to deal with, it's unending. From what I can see, is we have multiple sources of contamination out there that we're unaware of, unable to control. And we're going to be chasing this stuff till the day we die, and we're not going to beat it if that's the case. That's all I have to say.
Thanks, Phil. I actually lived in Germany for 3 years, about 30 years ago, and my experience then was that their water quality was much worse because they have had a lot more years to pollute than we have. There was a lot of places where the water was not safe to drink, and people didn't. Drinking tap water was considered really weird when I lived there because it typically wasn't safe. And a lot of places, like if you go to a public restroom, there'd be signs saying don't drink the water because it's not potable.
So, Madam Chair, I'm sorry.
Mr. Klein, if we could hold your question, Mr. Klein, we have a couple of people who have their hands raised, so I want to acknowledge them.
Yeah, I've got
First
Mike
one is
and Mark.
Mark Delayden and then Mike Wang.
Yeah, so we'll let Mike go first and then Mark.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. So I think that as we're kind of talking through this a little bit, one of the things that comes to mind is that, there's two different kind of groups of, classifications in a sense, or maybe two different buckets of the way we should kind of look at chemicals in terms of ones that are potentially harmful. There should be ones that are, either listed or ones that are maybe tracked by other agencies such as the EPA or maybe like FDA, things like that already have lists of known harmful chemicals, because that will obviously have a built-in frameworks for level of toxicity, amounts that are safe, and all these other different criteria that are used. And I think those should be from our perspective, are kind of our foundational baseline in which we look at our water quality and say, yeah, do we allow these different things? And I'm sure for there's key areas that we already do that, but then maybe as some of these other chemicals start popping up in industry or start popping up to water supplies, then perhaps there's an opportunity to look more closely at are we at levels that are in alignment with those guidelines. That said, then there's the other ones, like these new ones that are starting to pop up, as mentioned earlier, by others, that sometimes there's these new chemicals that maybe hit the media or whatever, but aren't necessarily on an FDA list yet, or aren't on on FDA's list because they're just so new or so maybe esoteric, relatively speaking. So in that case, then there should be some sort of process that we need to follow to really kind of look at and evaluate whether or not it's something we want to manage, and if we do choose to, then how do we evaluate the criteria by which we do that? And I think that right now, I don't, and maybe there is a framework that's out there that we use, and I'm still learning the process here. And then we follow that framework. But if there isn't, then what should that framework be for these newly identified things? So we're not trailing, months or years behind, regulatory bodies that are much larger, like the EPA, for example.
Thank you. And then Mark?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm kind of curious regarding, and the person that's from Savage I don't think is on, but they've got the unlined and the lined landfill. And I'm just curious, since garbage is always going to be with us until we just start taking pills and don't have to eat food and takeouts and all that sort of stuff. What kind of results have they had with those lined landfills compared to the unlined? I mean, are they doing a really good job, or are things still getting past the liners on those landfills? And I don't know, maybe nobody has the answers. Maybe they're still too new to find out for sure what's going on with them, but I'm just kind of curious on that, if anybody can answer that one.
Anyone? Go ahead, Catherine.
I mean, I can tell you briefly that, the Pollution Control Agency, we've done some monitoring for PFAS and 1,4-dioxane, which are kind of, contaminants, newer, more emerging contaminants at our closed landfills, which are older. And that's available, and we're planning to do some more follow-up monitoring, and are continuing to work on sort of what makes sense for monitoring at landfills, active landfills. I'm not in that program, but I know they consider it.
Follow-up question then. On all those closed landfills, are any of those lined, or were they all unlined? And what kind of line? Were they clay lines, or were they actually membrane lined?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I don't see any other hands raised, but I know,
Mike just raised his hand again. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I think one of the things I did want to take an opportunity was to share like something that I heard from a colleague in Brooklyn Park, and I think it's kind of relevant to this conversation. As we talk about landfills, it's not just landfills, but there's a concern about, like, for example, in some of the water sources that are used by, like, Brooklyn Park, for example, they're relatively shallow. So because that they're relatively shallow, the infiltration time it takes for water to get from the ground level into there is fairly short. And because of that, there's challenges with the response time for contaminants to get to the surface. So for example, it takes, in some deep aquifers, it takes like years and years to get down there. But then in Brooklyn Park, because they're relatively shallow, if there's some contaminants that enter the water supply, now you've got to deal with it quickly. And then the challenge there is, well, now you may need like a $40 million plant to deal with it, but you don't have $40 million sitting around, because there's a long runway to get to that point to develop that, even if it's a known contaminant, right? Let's make the assumption it's something known, but now you have the levels that were kind of okay for a while. Now they're starting to spike for one reason, but what choice do you have but live with that for a while until you can afford a $40 million plant, right? And I think the concern that was raised within that community was, how do we mitigate the risk of having to not have funding available to deal with this type of thing when these issues do start coming up, because they could start raising fairly quickly because of the nature of the water supply itself.
Yeah, that's a good point. We've already seen that in other smaller communities too, like Elko Newmarket having to put in a water treatment plant with very, very few people to pay for it and
Yeah.
seeing a big sticker shock for their water.
Mhm.
Phil, did you have anything else?
No, Madam Chair. No, I'll pass.
Okay, thanks. Does anybody else have anything? Mike, your hand is still up.
Mike's hand is up as well as Jamie's.
Okay, Jamie.
Yeah, just maybe a follow-up thought or question about where we look for contaminants. I know that in the news I hear and see about contaminants associated with landfills or industrial sites, and that's pretty common. But I don't have a good sense of how often that's really the source. If there are many other times that we find contaminants where we're not expecting, or maybe they're more dispersed across the landscape. That could impact private wells. There could be sources like nitrates from agricultural situations that we hear about. I don't know how common that is. Maybe that's something Catherine would be willing to speak to. But do we know where to look? I think we know where some of the hot spots have the potential to be, but do we need to be more broad in our search?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about sort of our surveillance monitoring. The EPA for surface waters has a regular 5-year cycle of what they call National Aquatic Resource Survey. So rivers and streams, and 1 year lakes, another year wetlands, another year. And as part of that, every 5 years, we add on contaminants of emerging concern. And again, I'm really focused here because my understanding was we're really focused on sort of unregulated new contaminants of emerging concern. So, not nitrate so much. And so we add that on and look for those contaminants every 5 years, and it's designed to be statistically representative. So you get kind of that broad brush of what's showing up in the water. And so that's kind of what I was talking about in terms of like, what are the early phases of this is here? What does that mean that we're seeing it? Do we need to try to figure out where it's coming from? And we also try to regularly look at part of our ambient groundwater network at PCA. So we have 270 fairly shallow wells scattered around the state. And we tend to look at about 40 of them every year for these contaminants of emerging concern and go around so we can try to get that broad picture.
Thank you.
You're only doing 40 out of 270 wells. It may take a long time to get through the cycle and get all the wells.
Yeah, we try to, go around and also stick with land use settings where it's more likely. We have some very forested areas where it's maybe doesn't need to be checked as often.
Thanks.
Chair-
Does
Chair,
anybody
at this
else have
time,
any questions?
I do not see anybody else with their hands raised at this time.
Okay, well then before we move on to the group exercise, Emily can share some more information.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for sharing comments, everyone. That was really enlightening, and I learned a lot. Craig, can you pull up the PowerPoint presentation again and go to slide 11? Great, thank you. So one last slide before the group exercise. I wanted to share this map of how today's information will be used and how we will progress over the year. This kind of map path will be used for all of the topics we discussed this year. It's kind of like a rinse and repeat format. So the draft problem statements and recommended actions that are supported by MOSAC will go into the MOSAC report that goes to the council and the legislature. So throughout the year, it will be an iterative process between the council and MOSAC and TAC, kind of back and forth to edit, provide more comments, to give time for the space and feedback. So I just wanted to share that so you can see where we are going. We envision the back and forth and editing to kind of overlap, the next meetings. So we'll be thinking about these topics all year. Okay, that is all I had. So now Lanya will lead in the group exercise to review the draft problem statement and recommended actions.
All right, well, that was a good warm up, I think, for this activity that we have planned using the mural board. So before I get started, I'm going to give you a little time to shift gears mentally and walk through the tool we'll be using, a little orientation. So this exercise is going to be done using Mural, which is an online workspace, sort of a digital whiteboard. And this morning you should have received an email, and it's also, I believe, in the meeting invitation with a link to the Mural board. So I'll talk a little bit while you go and find that link. I see some of you have already joined, but not everyone. And we'll be doing some interactive work here, but this is the first time we've used it, so I know it's going to be a learning curve for everybody. We will always give you the option to raise your hand and share any reactions verbally as well. So if you can't access or just don't want to use Mural, we can have a conversation as well. We'll be taking input both ways. Next slide. If after this meeting you want to learn how to do this tool a little bit more, because I think we'll be using this at subsequent meetings remotely, there is a link to some tutorials here in the presentation. Next slide. And I am actually going to share my screen in a moment. But before I do, I just wanted to walk you through some of the functionality. So the mural board that I'm going to take you to looks something like what you're seeing now. And I can see some of you are moving around in it just fine, but to help you navigate, I just wanted to let you know that you can click your mouse button and drag, and that will kind of move you around the board. If you want to zoom in and out, you can either use the Control plus and Control minus, and that will go in and out. Or if you have a scroll wheel on your mouse, that will also zoom in and out. So that's how you can be independent and go rogue and move around. If you just want to follow me, you can hover over the LR icon that's at the bottom. It will be at the bottom of your web page, a little gold star. And a little menu should pop up, and follow Lanya or follow the facilitator should be an option. So I see somebody is following me. And you'll go wherever I go, if that's the case. Finally, to navigate, there will be an outline, a sort of set of gray boxes on the right side of your web page. And if you click on one of those boxes, it will take you to that part of the mural board where we're going to be doing the exercise. And then finally, to add content and edit things, you should be able to edit these little sticky notes by double clicking on them. And then you can type in comments. That's one way you can also add new sticky notes. So you might double click and a new sticky note will appear and you can edit in there. So that's just some background navigation. Again, if this is driving you bonkers, raise your hand and you can contribute your comments verbally as well. Next slide. So I'm actually going to move away from this PowerPoint presentation, but I did just want to let you know, again, if you don't have access to Mural, and I see I see 11 of you here in the Mural board with me, so I'm assuming it's working for most. But if you run into trouble with Mural, the exercise descriptions are also in this PowerPoint presentation that was attached to the agenda. So if you want to follow along and kind of know what we're doing, you'll know what we're doing just by following the PowerPoint. And so there's a couple of slides with descriptions of the exercises in the PowerPoint presentation. But, and the mural board was kind of matched to this content, so you're not missing anything. But now, seeing that most people are accessing the mural board, I'm going to share my screen. And I have a question for you, because now I'm in this interesting world where I can only see the WebEx off to the side. Sorry for that, that pause there. I was digesting what my screen looks like now. Are you guys looking at a sort of Google Chrome web page, or do you see like my entire screen, my entire desktop and all of my open layers?
I just see Chrome and your Chrome, you have 3 Chrome tabs and you're in one of them.
Perfect. All right. Thank you for that. I am going to start this exercise now. So if you can see my mouse, you'll see down along the bottom, I see a lot of participants. Some of you shared your names. Some of you are anonymous. If anybody is having trouble accessing this website, please raise your hand and let us know, and we'll get you the link. Hearing nothing. Let's get started.
Any hands raised, Lanya.
Thank you, Susan. All right. I will let you know ahead of time, this might get a little messy. That's what we're going for. And this might move a little quickly. As we it's a learning curve and we're thinking at the same time. And that's okay, because this is not the only time we're going to get your input on this. What we collect today is going to go into a draft report, and you'll have time to add more content and revise things again. So this is not a get it right now and forever hold your peace. This is the beginnings of this conversation. So I just want to make sure you're not feeling too much pressure, but just we're going to lean in and experiment. So first, I want to give you all a minute or so to read and consider this proposed problem statement, the sort of description of the challenge and the goal. And after a minute, bear with me here. I am going to hide everybody's cursors so that you guys aren't blocking each other's reading. If you read this language, think about if it works for you, if you hate it. And in just a minute, I'm gonna give you an option to put some sticky dots, sort of a dot voting exercise, just to get a sense of where you feel. I apologize if I deleted anybody's sticky note that they wanted there.
Tanya, this is Susan. Is there a way for you to expand your screen at all?
Expand it?
Make it bigger?
Yeah.
Is that any better?
Thank you. Yep. Thank
Thanks
you.
for the coaching. Continuous improvement. And actually,
On that, I think we can also zoom in on our own on the WebEx. On the left side, I was just able to do a zoom in and kind of rearrange where Lanya's page was, which made it bigger.
thank you. Yeah, sharing these technical tips is excellent. All right, I'm gonna lead us in a vote now. I know some of you had time to read. And one vote, any number. What I'm gonna ask you to do is now, if you click on one of those numbers, 8 to 1, in the sort of blue bars along the bottom, it'll put a little sticky dot. It's gonna be kind of tiny, but it'll be there. And 12 of you are gonna vote, so I'll keep an eye on when you've all voted. If you want to change your vote, if you shift click on that tiny dot, it will remove it and you can put it somewhere else. Your vote is anonymous and we won't see the votes until everybody's done. Again, 8, you like it? It's perfect the way it is. 1, no. 7 through 2 is anything in between. Ready? Go. Again, at this point, if you just click on one of those numbers, your vote should appear. For example, I just clicked on 7 and you can see this little tiny sticker up in the corner. I hover over it and hit the shift button and click again, it disappears. See, a couple people are still voting. I'll give it a couple more minutes. Not minutes, seconds. All right. I'm going to end it. 3, 2, 1. End. And if you didn't get to vote, but you want to share, in just a moment, I'll ask for your verbal votes here. So we have 2 votes for abstaining, no opinion, need questions answered. We've got 2 for the endorse. 2 unique voters. And then we have some with some formal disagreement, but willing to go with the majority. So 8 unique voters. So some changes suggested, I'm hearing. And you can see, whoops, where our votes fell on the list here. So some endorsement, but definitely some questions and some suggestions for revision. So I will invite us now to the second exercise. And before I do that, does anybody have verbally want to share that they didn't vote, but they'd like to add their, on a scale of 1 to 8, how they feel about it?
If you could go ahead and raise your hand if you wanted to share that verbally. I do not see any hands raised at this time, Lanya.
All right, well, we'll dive into some actual more detailed work then. Knowing that there's room for improvement here, I invite you to take the next minute or so to share your suggestions for what would make you support this more strongly. What would you change? Or would you suggest a more specific action? So this is sort of a brainstorming, but what do you need to see to more strongly support a goal related to emerging water quality and contamination challenges? And if you double click on one of these sticky notes, you should be able to add comments. Or if you just double click in the white space, a new sticky note will appear that you can edit.
Lanya, if I could, while members are doing that, we want to make sure that this environment, this particular exercise is for our committee members. And if we have staff members who are also watching the mural exercise, they should not be placing any feedback on there.
Thank you for that
So
caution.
just a reminder to our staff.
And you also remind me as well. I know that this is not easy to read as a shared screen, particularly for those who are just following along. But we will be capturing all of the comments in this exercise, and they will be included in the meeting minute notes. So that will be available. You're not losing any content if you can't read the teeny tiny font in this exercise. So this is our virtual version of sort of small group discussion at a public meeting.
I just wanted to acknowledge in the chat while members are doing that, committee member Delayden needs to leave for another meeting. So he's wishing everybody a good day.
Thank you for being here. And I also see comments being added, so keep up with that. But if anybody is having trouble and would prefer to share their comments verbally, please, you're welcome to do that, and I can type those into the notes, and we'll capture them in the meeting notes as well.
I do not see any hands raised at this time, Lanya.
Thank you, Susan. I know for those of you following along, not in the WebEx meeting, the quiet space feels a little odd, but when you are typing, it's kind of that deep thinking time. This is where I want to add the soundtrack music, hold music.
And unfortunately, we are unable to do that for copyright reasons. So then we just have to sing.
You are all welcome that I am not singing.
Kevin Watson acknowledging that he needs to leave as well.
All
For
right.
webinar.
All right. Thank you for being here, and we'll be sure to send out detailed notes.
As a reminder for everyone, we are steering away from the chat if at all possible. We may have members of the public who are viewing this on cell phones may not be able to see the chat, so we do steer away from using the chat. If you have a comment, like you need to leave, or verbal comments, please make sure that you unmute yourself or raise your hand. We'll get you called on and acknowledge your comment. So we want to make sure that those are called out verbally.
Yeah. I see that there's a couple of comments still being added, but in the interest of time, I think when those comments are complete, we'll move on. Again, we're just collecting your input. We're going to be putting this into a draft, so you'll be asked to look at this again, and we'll be adding a little more detail. Ooh, as soon as I say we're wrapping up, we get a couple more comments started.
That's the way it goes.
Because the next
Lanya,
thing. Oh,
this
yeah.
is Wendy. I have a question.
Yes.
So on those vote results, I could see some of them were the number, but some of them were little white squares that looked like they had tiny writing in them, and I couldn't tell what they were.
On
The voting thing that we just did that had 8 votes before we came to the
yeah.
post-it notes.
Okay, whoever's continuing to type, keep typing.
So we can definitely look into that, Wendy. We'll make sure that it's visible.
Because yeah, those 2 little white ones that are the first ones in each row,
this text
I have
box,
no idea what they are.
people voted on the language box.
What does that mean?
That means that somebody put a click on the value. So instead of clicking on a number, they clicked on the text itself.
Oh, okay.
So, and we weren't, I mean, it was just a sort of poll of generally where were people feeling with the language as it stood. So,
yeah, I just wanted to make sure I understand, because that meant nothing to me, because all it is a little block, white box with little tiny letters in it. So I had no idea what it was.
Gotcha. Yep. And you'll see when we vote, you can vote on some of the different mural board elements. So a text box or a sticky note or a graphic. And this is on me to be really clear. When we ask for those sort of sticky dot exercises, the elements we need to be putting our dots on. I'll be more clear about that. And I am now going to move us on in the interest of time. Again, in another dot voting exercise or a sticky note exercise, I want you to take a moment and look over all the comments. So some of the input that your fellow committee members shared. And I'm going to give you another sticky dot exercise, and I'll ask you to put dots. I'll give you 3 dots because 3 is the magic number. put dots on any of the sticky notes that you really want to elevate or highlight. You're like, yeah, that's a good idea. So that's my first vote. Okay.
And Lanya, just to clarify context, we want to make sure that we're not calling this voting exercise.
This is not a committee vote. This is a sticky dot
Feedback.
sticky dot feedback exercise. Brainstorming. We're still brainstorming. So we're going to call this one ideas to highlight. I'm going to give you 3 sticky dots. So put your 3 sticky dots on the orange Post-its that you want to highlight. We'll do this in like 30 seconds.
And as a reminder, again, staff members should not be voting on this. This is for our committee members.
Quick spy on. Oh, we've got a couple people. We go 5, 4, 3, 1. Last call. I'm going to end the session. All right. So,
Lanya, before you
Yeah.
go on, Susan Morris has her hand raised.
excellent. What would you like us to highlight, Susan?
Oh, sorry. So now when you just did it that way, I could actually see them. For some reason, I can't get it any bigger on my screen, so I'm really struggling to read the text in those boxes.
And you're following along on my screen.
Correct. Yeah.
If you have it open, just as a using this technology, if you have the mural board open in your website, we can zoom in a little bit more, but let me pull.
And again, Lanya, this is where like in WebEx, if my cursor was on the left, I had have my own zoom in controls that pop up. There's like a little box that has a squiggle and a ask to control and then a zoom in and out.
Okay. So we'll, I may send out after this meeting too. I love to share these kind of tips and tricks. We might send out a tips and tricks with WebEx and with Mural as I'm learning the challenges to interact. So I'm filing these things away in my head to help us do better next time. I did zoom in a little. Did that help at all?
Yeah, that helps a lot. And sorry, probably when you were going through all the tutorial, a friend stopped by with well wishes and a flower, so I had to step away right when you were probably explaining all the important stuff I should know right now.
Well wishes and flowers are very important. I think that trumps it.
Okay, thank
They're
you.
always good.
So, oh, okay. So, but really quickly.
Any other hands raised at this time, Lanya, so you can continue.
Excellent. So the vote, and we'll share these again in the minutes. We're seeing that multiple people wanted to highlight particularly process policy for dealing with emerging contaminants, that's something we want to focus on. Noted that the goal does not have a measurable outcome or timeline, so we'll have to tackle that. And we need a clearer goal, such as a shared framework to evaluate emerging contaminants or something along those lines. Also highlighted were a layperson or elected official likely won't know what this means, so we need to add more specificity maybe. There was a comment that they don't like the wording that there is always potential, which can imply low importance. So words like we are not always proactive or prepared imply that we often are. So we'll have to think of some wording. And then also not understanding the second sentence. How does a framework to maintain equitable approaches relate to contaminants? So fair point, defining framework and then also the equity. How are we talking and thinking about equity? Also votes on needing measurable metrics for progress, needs shared criteria for what's a level of concern, and also votes on public transparency to decision-making criteria. Thank you for that comment. This input is going to be used to shape and revise this draft language, and we'll be bringing that back to you. So moving on. And I saw some ideas from those Post-its that you just created that might be brought over into this activity. But we did want to get your input on some of the actions or ideas that were proposed in various conversations we've had over the years. So what you're looking at right now, and you don't need to see the details on this, but thinking about the patterns, is each of these sticky notes was an idea in the attached recommendation memo that you have as part of your agenda. So just as a reference, it's information from this document. And so some of these are sort of financial related actions. The orange is outreach and engagement related. Light blue is research. Green is more regulatory or rule. Dark green might be regional policy related activities. And gray are ideas that were shared by TAC members at their last meeting. And this is the order that the TAC members sorted these actions into. We use this matrix that kind of ranked these actions based on TAC perspectives on whether they had a smaller or maybe a more short-term impact on our goal of being more prepared for emerging contaminants. So on the left, and then the axis on the right are those with a bigger or more long-term impact, getting us toward our goal. And then the vertical axis up towards the top were those activities that were perceived to be easier to implement. And then down on the bottom are those that might be harder to implement. So what we're seeing is in the upper right quadrant, activities that TAC perceived as being relatively easy to implement with a bigger or more long-term goal. And those on the lower left being solutions, approaches, activities that are harder to implement and have a smaller or maybe more of a short-term immediate impact on our goal. And there's a lot of different ways of thinking about this. But I would invite you to take a minute to look these over and think about how well, from your perspective and your experience, you think they might help us achieve the goal. And that's that all of our region's communities are more prepared for new and emerging contaminants, and that they're empowered to be working to provide safe water. And you might want to add something if anything is missing. So if you just double click in a white space, you should create a new Post-it. You want to drag that one over there. Oops, sorry. You can do that. And then alternatively, if you disagree with this sorting, feel free to click on the Post-it and move it and drag it to where you think it would be. And when we're done, I'm going to ask you again, we're going to do a sticky dot exercise to highlight anything you think we could start sooner rather than later. So I will give us, does anybody have an estimate how much time you'd like for this exercise? I'll put a timer on for this.
So Lanya, just a quick time check. We have 18 minutes left in our time today.
Okay. So I'm going to do it at 2 minutes for you to sort of review. And you can see that there's a little timer going on here in the upper bar of this website. So these would be specific actions. And if you want to click, yes, Susan?
Well, this is Wendy. I'm going to do the dummy way and just talk to you because I'm a little overwhelmed by all the clicking and editing. But the one in the bottom left corner about private well owners. So my son and daughter-in-law bought a house last year that was on a well in a rural township out just outside of the 7-county metro area, and they had to have their water tested for the mortgage company. The mortgage company wanted the reassurance that they weren't buying something that had bad water. So I don't know that point of sale is even necessary for a government to declare it, because the mortgage companies, unless you're paying cash for your house, I think probably a lot of mortgage companies want to make sure your well is safe and your septic system working before they're going to approve a mortgage. But also, if you don't, just taking out the point of sale part, it's actually pretty easy to implement, because counties send out, property tax statements and whatnot a couple times a year, your house valuation, and then your property tax, potential property taxes later in the year. So they could just put a flyer in there. A lot of counties do that, flyers for various things. Throw a flyer in there to say, hey, if you want to get your well water tested to make sure you're safe, this is, here's a website to go to and order your test or whatever, and this is how you do it. So I don't think it's hard to implement, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I moved it, I added a little bit of detail to it, and I
Okay,
moved it up into easier.
thank you.
It's kind of although maybe I should.
And Lonnie, I don't know if I can jump in right there with the private well stuff. Since in Dakota County, we do a lot of the private well.
Whoever is speaking, we cannot hear you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me a little bit better now? This is Valerie.
That's better. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was just going to speak real quick on the private well piece, since we do a lot of private well sampling in Dakota County. Encouraging the private well owner is one thing. Getting to actually do it is another thing. So I think that's, the hard part is not the encouraging, but actually getting private well owners to follow up and do the testing. Even with offering free testing, absolutely free, we can only get about 30% participation. So I think that that's really where the hard part comes in.
And if we can acknowledge, was that committee member Grover?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And Valerie, I have a question for you. If 30% of the private well owners go ahead, does that give you enough kind of scatter plot to figure out if there are areas that have problems or not?
I think it gives us at least a fairly good idea, but what we're finding is it's very, depending on the contaminant, it's very variable depending on the depth of the wells, because a lot of these private wells, some are, prior to the well code, so they could be very shallow, others could be very deep. So it's very dependent on location in the county as well as depth. So I think it's kind of hit or miss, but we can at least get like percentages based off location. So it's a little helpful, but if the key is making sure that people are drinking healthy water, I mean, the thing that we struggle with is, how do we get people to actually participate? How do we get people to take advantage of these opportunities that are out there? And I think MDH has struggled with this as well, where it seems like 30% is kind of the norm. Even like we've actually sent test kits out to people, like completely free. All you have to do is fill the bottle up and return it, and still only a little over 30% participate. So it's amazing to figure out kind of what are the barriers to people participating in that program. But then depending on the chemical, like mostly what we do is like the nitrates, manganese, lead, chloride, but obviously depending on some of these other chemicals that we've talked about, like PFAS, some of that testing is super expensive. So that is not something that would probably be done at each private well, unless that private well owner is really concerned about it. So.
Lanya?
Thank you.
This is Susan. I just wanted to give you a time check. We had item that on our speaking notes that we were going to go through each committee member to get any additional feedback before we wrap up. So I wanted to make sure we had time for that.
Thank you very much for that time. And given that, I'll walk you through what I was going to do as more of a group exercise, but I think we could do this verbally instead. And that would be, I was curious of these activities, the ones that were existing, our sense of how easy or what the impact would be, and your new ideas. I'd be interested to know if you see anything here that would be really something we could start doing now versus some things we might need to kind of start setting the framework for, and we'll really be working on a little later. I was going to have us do a little dot exercise, but I think if you want to just verbally, we'll kind of go through the members, share if there's anything you really think we might want to start now. And related to that, I was going to ask for some ideas about, if we want to lead on something, are there some examples of an existing effort that could be used as a model? Or if you wanted to share your ideas about what makes a good leader for work in that particular area, your experience, you've worked on projects, what works, what doesn't, or if there's any critical partners. So I'll just open it up for more of a general conversation if the committee feels comfortable with that.
Lanya, would you like me to go down the list?
I think that could work, and it would just be, final thoughts, your ideas for what might be some good activities to think about and who might be good leaders or partners and why. Is that, Wendy, would that work for you?
That works for me, especially if Susan does the list.
All right.
Oh,
Excellent.
come on, you don't want to do the list?
No, I don't. Sometimes when I'm trying to think and chair and do too many things at once, it just gets to be a lot. So yeah, go ahead.
I am of course happy to help.
And then I would just say, in the interest of time, everybody is, kind of short and impactful so everybody gets a chance to speak. And this is just the beginnings of this conversation. Again, this will be used to iterate. You'll be hearing this content again.
Yep. And I will call out your name, and like Lanya said, if you could be concise, I'm going to try to capture that in the notes. So first up, and if you don't have anything, you can just say pass. So first up is Mr. Berg.
Yeah, Jeff Burke. So I've been kind of hovering in the background, not really a lot of interaction, but thanks, Lanya. I mean, very nice virtual form of kind of doing the dot exercise and quadrant. So what I see here in general looks good. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Gleason.
Yeah, thanks for your work on this, and I pass on further comment.
Okay. Ms. Grover.
Hi, this is Valerie. Yeah, again, reiterate, thanks so much. I guess my only comment is I think I agree with the tax assessment that really it comes down to funding, and because there's just so many uncertainties with contaminants concerns. So getting the funding available to not only determine what the concern is, but respond to it, that's going to be the key, I think. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wang?
I didn't have any additional comments to add.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Klein?
Yeah, I'd have to agree with the previous caller that the funding is going to be probably the biggest issue that we're going to be dealing with. And then trying to wrap our arms around some type of policy and procedures to help mitigate the contamination. That is going to be, I think, our second biggest obstacle. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Morris?
I'll pass.
Thank you. Ms. Nuschler?
I think this is an area where we have to get really clear on our definitions. Have been very much thinking emerging contaminants, but then there's also, it says new sources of contamination. So does that mean a contaminant we already know about and we already have values for, but we know it's coming from a new place? Or are we really talking about those emerging things like microplastics and pharmaceuticals and things like that, where we don't have values and we maybe don't know how to communicate what's safe and what isn't, and we need to learn more. So I think in seeing these, like what's going on in these sticky notes in terms of like emergency response and, you know, some of what I think was good conversation about private well testing. A lot of those are not things that I think of as necessarily dealing with emerging contaminants. So I think we just have to be really clear on what all of the pieces mean. What are we trying to tackle?
Thank you for that. And I appreciate that particularly because thinking about where could Met Council in our long range planning role and some of our regional system operation role add value to this conversation is a question that I have. So clarifying that I think will be really important. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on, Mr. Sherman.
Yeah, similar thoughts to others. The funding part, I think, is a big thing that we can do at a regional scale. Locally, I'm certainly interested in building up the capacity that's already happening for private well testing. And Catherine's comment about that not being, really well tied to emerging contaminants right now, and wondering out loud if, knowing that we can't test for everything, but are there times that we should use private well testing to occasionally explore the extent and nature of certain emerging contaminants? Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. West Hafner.
Thank you. I agree with a lot of the comments. I think what I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around is just that I think a couple people ago said it, just that it's kind of, I'm not sure what we're working on, if that makes sense. I do like, kind of the color coding and thinking about it in that way and kind of where things are falling, but I need a little bit more definition to it and defining the words and that kind of thing. I think one of the things that I popped up was just kind of that understanding of the different terms and things too. So,
yeah, thank you.
Okay. Chair Wolf.
I'll pass. Am I the last one on the list?
I wanted to just do a call out. Is there anybody that we have missed that is on our committee? Hearing none, that should be it.
Okay, so we're moving on to next steps. Staff will begin drafting the MOSAC report using committee's input. And of course, if you think of something or have questions, you're free to email Catherine about the information that was presented earlier, or if you think of questions or have more input you want to give, you can email staff, Lanya, and others, because this is not, like they said, not the last time we're going to hear this information or have input on the information. So there's a lot to digest in a short period of time. MOSSEC members that are parts of agencies should update your agency leaders to expect a report with all this information. And we'll plan for the next meeting on July 20th, which will be the intersection of land use and water supply. Is there anything else that committee members hear as next steps?
Chair Lanya Ross has her hand raised.
Go ahead, Lanya.
And I just wanted to, hope my video is working. But I just wanted to acknowledge too, I think that this warm up in this conversation about contamination does connect very strongly with next meeting's conversation about land use and water supply in several ways. And so if you have thoughts about that connection to land use too, share them with us as we design that meeting.
Thank you.
Okay, no
If
further.
nobody else has
at this time.
Pardon? Nobody's raised?
No other hands raised at this time.
Okay. So before we end, does anybody want to share what worked for this meeting or what you would like done differently in the future? You don't have to raise your hand. You can just speak up.
Yeah, I think I like the use of Mural to facilitate discussion and sharing ideas. I think it sort of made it easier for people to share and not feel like they're necessarily just make sure that everyone was heard and could share information freely.
Yeah, I agree. With having a bunch of people try to give input, it gives some efficiency to the meeting.
Mhm. Yep.
Anybody else? Okay. There being no further business, we are adjourned. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you, everyone.
Oh, did
Thank
you
you.
want to make a announcement, Susan?
Oh,
Sorry, forgot about it.
sure. Sure. So I'm going to turn my video on. For those that are still on the call, I'm going to ask Tessa Wagenke if did she leave? There she is. Tessa Wagenke has gone on video right now, and I wanted to let everyone know on the call that Tessa is going to be taking over the coordination of the MOSAC meetings going forward. I am going to be focusing on some other work, and having this lift of having someone take this committee off of my plate is very welcomed. So I wanted to formally introduce Tessa Wagenke to the committee, and so that you can put a face with a voice and a name. And she's been observing today. I'll be training her over the next couple of months, and she will be taking this role starting the next meeting, and I get to step back and be an observer. So welcome, Tessa. Yeah, we cannot hear you, Tessa. So, all right. Oh, thank you, Lanya. I appreciate it. All right, I am complete. So, Chair, if you want to close us out.
Okay, thank you, Susan, and welcome, Tessa, and thank you, everybody else, for your participation today, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 months. Meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.